Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, How to Think About Strategic Partnerships, Collaborations, and even Merger. Today, we welcome Nadya Shmavonian, Director of the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund with us today as we look to discuss the precursors to contemplating a strategic collaboration that could lead to building sustainability and mission continuity. Before we go any further, I just want to take a brief moment to review the functionality of our Zoom webinar. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract us from listening to the webinar. And for our discussion today, if you have any questions as we have our discussion, please enter them in the Q&A box. You can access that by clicking the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you see a question that is similar to yours or one that you would like to make sure we get to, you can tap on the thumbs up icon to the left of the question. That will move the question to the top of the queue. We can take questions as we go, and for questions we don't get to by the time that we end at 10:15, we'll try to answer offline and follow up via email. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the video will be emailed to all who registered by the end of the day tomorrow. And I also just want to take a brief moment to thank all our members and supporters, as well as our board of directors who enable us to bring you this webinar today. Since the pandemic, we have been able to bring you some of the very best thinking about how to navigate these challenging times. If you are a member and your membership is up for renewal, I hope you consider renewing. And if you're not a member yet and find value in this webinar and any other associated resources or support, I hope you will continue and consider, I should say, joining. Now, I'm happy to introduce our presenter this morning. Nadya is a partner at SeaChange Capital Partners and is also the director of the Greater Philadelphia Nonprofit Repositioning Fund. She has extensive foundation management experience, having served as vice president for strategy at the Rockefeller Foundation, the executive vice president at the Pew Charitable Trust. She serves on the board as board president of the Social Impact Commons, the nation's first incubator and shared services platform for the fiscal sponsorship field. She's also a senior fellow at the Wharton Center for Leadership and Change Management and teaches graduate seminars on nonprofit governance at the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania, where she was awarded the 2018 Excellence in Teaching Award. So we're very happy to welcome Nadya virtually with us here today in Louisville. So Nadya, welcome. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this is we're just having a conversation discussion today. There's no formal presentation. So again, if you have any questions as we have our conversation, please let us know. But I'd like to go ahead and start the conversation, Nadya, this morning by asking you if you could tell us a little bit about the history of the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund and how it came about and its mission.
Okay, sure. So thank you for that introduction, Merv, and I'm very happy to speak to you all in Louisville. There are some advantages, I guess, to this new medium we find ourselves in, and I care deeply about talking about this work wherever and however I can. And the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund was launched 5 years ago. Actually, well, this summer I was hired 5 years ago as a consultant to help with it. We launched in the fall of 2015, and it was an idea that was generated by a group of funders in the 5-county Philadelphia area that had been receiving inquiries from nonprofits that were thinking about some form of strategic collaboration. Particularly, they were a lot of organizations were approaching funders thinking about mergers, even acquisitions, and wanted help. And the funders had learned of pooled funding models in 2 other cities, New York and Los Angeles, where funders had pooled their resources and shared their learning and centralized their services through a common fund initiative, and developed that for the Philadelphia region and hired me to do it. I think the one piece that you didn't share about my background, which is sometimes looks like a sensitive one, is that I, in addition to most of my career as a funder, I had led a national nonprofit, public-private ventures, and was hired in 2010 to try to turn it around. Worked very hard to try to do that, but 2.5 years later, the board and I made the very, very difficult decision to close a storied nonprofit, and to wind down in a planned way over the course of 15 weeks. So I have been on both sides of the coin, and when I was approached to do this, this gig, which is working between funders, helping to assess and make grants to nonprofits that are looking at some fundamental change to their business model, it certainly spoke to me as a good opportunity to put, both of those experiences, funder and challenged nonprofit executive, into a hopefully constructive role for our region.
So that's terrific. That's quite a body of experience there, Nadya. So based on your two experiences there, then how does one with the organization and or with the funder, a conversation about collaboration or other strategic partnerships get started? Like how does that, what's that process like before a nonprofit engages in inquiring about funding with the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund?
Yeah, and I realized I didn't address kind of what we were set up to do. One is, I think more than anything, my role is to help normalize the conversation and the strategic consideration of nonprofit collaboration. So when we started 5 years ago, there in Pennsylvania, we were in the middle of a budget impasse at the state level, and we had just we're coming out of the Great Recession, and nonprofits were starting to recognize that business as usual just probably wasn't going to cut it in all instances going forward. So we were part of a solution set trying to help give other options. And if I said the number one thing I care about is helping, as I said, to normalize or just routinize the strategic consideration of of sustained collaboration. And the way we work, which is probably helpful just to make it a little clearer to nonprofits. As I said, I was hired I was a consultant. I was freestanding at the time I started, and set up independently of the 8 or 9 foundations at the time that had provided funding. And my job was to be a very safe space, and continues to be a very safe space, for nonprofits that are thinking about collaboration, or even just thinking they need to do something different in their operations and their business model. And I set up calls with anybody that wants to reach out. We just did an evaluation of our first couple years, and I think more than anything, just having that very neutral, safe space to turn to for nonprofits is really important. And I hold all of those, what I would call pipeline or early inquiry conversations, fully confidential. I don't share with my board, the board is all of the funders. Right now we have 10 funders, and they have representatives who serve on my board. I don't tell them who's in the hopper until or unless we get to a point where it's clear there really is a meaningful either due diligence process that needs to occur, or in fact, two or more groups are ready to move forward with an actual transaction. In that event, I will take grant recommendations for either exploratory grants, which is the due diligence phase, or for one-time costs associated with the implementation. And at that time, our funders learn who's in there. But I will engage in those conversations sometimes for years. As things happen. There's a really hot idea, and then it falls apart. But that same individual will pick up the phone again a year later and say, we're not going forward with this dance partner. We have another nonprofit we're pretty far down the pike with. Could we still talk to you? So that's kind of how the intake process occurs. And I would say 90 to 95% of the calls don't necessarily immediately move into some kind of a grant. It may be I just give them some informal advice in terms of additional steps they could take to further suss out whether there is a there. It might be just an individual organization calling, and we don't do anything until there's another partner identified, but I can also give that individual organization ideas about where to turn and so on. And I am a native Philadelphian, so, and I had made a lot of grants when I was at Pew in the Philadelphia region, so I'm pretty well connected with the nonprofit and funding community, and I think that informal advice is a part of what our funders pay for through this pooled funding collaborative. And again, they were in the early days painstakingly clear that they didn't want me housed in one of their offices. The Philadelphia Foundation, which is a community foundation, received grants from the funders, but they didn't want me sitting in an office because they didn't want the exposure of two sets of grantees potentially walking in to meet with me, because that would immediately get people talking about, oh, there must be a deal going on with those two agencies. And so we really have protected confidentiality a great deal and made that safe space a number one priority. And the other priority is that I am very neutral. And I joke with people that I really am like Geneva. I don't say you should match with this organization. I never set up the matches, but I'm always there to receive them and help them assess the merits.
That's terrific. I love that approach. The whole safe space idea, and then the neutral Geneva. So can you talk a little bit more about what that's like, not in terms of what the conversation, but what is what is having a safe space for folks to come to mean and look like, and how do you sort of manage that conversation? So a nonprofit would come in, they say, I'm thinking about this, or I have these issues, and then you kind of just close the doors and just have a conversation?
Yeah, and actually almost all of what I do is frankly by phone, until or unless that there is something significant going on and it's important to have everyone in the room. So I can kind of eyeball this board chair and that board chair and see if they're really serious about this. But at the first, it's always a phone inquiry. I encourage, when there are the two partners already identified, encourage both leadership from both organizations to be on the call. Sometimes it's just the EDs on that first call, and they will share. It's a very kind of, as you can expect, a first blush call, trying to understand how long have they known each other, how long have they worked together, why now, what do they, what do they have a sense of what shape a collaboration might take, why, what are the complementarities, what are the questions that they have yet to answer in order to know whether to go forward. And if they are calling me because they want some support for exploratory due diligence, then we have a more in-depth conversation about how much they have already looked at, what are the questions they need to have answered, how do they start thinking about the sequence of answering those questions. But I really am looking for just a sense of the shared purpose that they have come to, that they've had enough conversation together to understand how this potential collaboration, even if they're not fully sure yet what the structure of that might be, how and why it advances their respective missions, right? So, is it because they have worked together for 10 years, they've done summer festivals together, and they think there's a really interesting, they've been very compatible, and now they're recognizing that, let's say it's, performing arts, this arts organization has a really strong administrative platform and maybe marketing platform. This organization doesn't have as strong a platform, but has a really interesting audience reach that would be complementary to this group, and that there may be some shared service arrangement, for example, where they might benefit from coming together. So it's, just to try to understand, how do the jigsaw pieces come together? and how are they seeing that, and how much have they tested that, or how nascent an idea is it at this point.
So do you have a formal like assessment process that they fill out, or questions that you send to them ahead of time for to make sure that they have thought about these things, or is it kind of an organic, natural process and conversation that just kind of happens?
I actually, it is that the first intake call is, I would say, more organic, and I have a series of questions that I will ask. We have questions on our website that are guidance, for how generically, how should organizations think about their potential for partnership. But the first conversation is really almost just kind of getting a look, a sort of field test in terms of how closely aligned are they in their thinking. Am I sensing some hesitance on one side? Are they speaking, are they singing out of a similar hymnal, even if it's not the same hymnal? And I will ask basic questions about their finances, about their leadership, and kind of go through that inventory for my own peace of mind. How large is their staff? Really important though is, why now? Why are you guys thinking about doing this now? And also asking whether either of the organizations has had prior experience with, let's say, if they're contemplating a merger, it's really good to know if anyone's had that experience yet, because it's a lot of work and very, very involved. And, part of it is sussing out, do they have the real stomach for this? How serious are they? And then if, based on that, and perhaps maybe several conversations, it's clear that they might be ready to apply, and that we would consider it a worthy transaction potentially, then I will invite a proposal. And the proposal, of course, has a lot of rigorous questions, kind of trying to understand where they are in the process. And it's a different proposal, whether it's a due diligence grant or whether it's implementation. If it's a due diligence grant, it's the most important thing is, have they identified who they want to work with as a third-party consultant to help them answer key questions? And do they have the sequence and the questions as right as possible, so that you move in a very logical way, and you don't get to question 12, which is a clear go, no go question that you could have asked in the very beginning of the process. Because we all know the one thing more scarce than financial resources for nonprofits is time. And, staff are, usually, these are leanly staffed organizations, and to engage in one of these processes takes a great deal of executive time. And so I consider it really important for us to not take a proposal lightly. And one of the things that we do, which one could maybe disagree with, but this is pretty common among the other cities that have these kinds of funds as well, we do not give money for ongoing staff time, right? So if you get an exploratory grant, it's all passed through to the third-party providers who are either going to help you with the negotiations. That's, I think, probably the most important thing. Might be helping you with legal questions, might be helping you with financial questions, but none of the money sticks to the lead organization. And in part, we do this to make sure that there's genuine skin in the game from the nonprofit. This isn't just another way to bring money into the nonprofit itself. It is because the organizations are dead serious about exploring this and are willing to put their own kind of sweat and blood into the process. And I initially, the first year I was leading the fund, I kind of didn't agree with that. But I actually have come to appreciate that it's a really important measure of commitment.
So I'd love to stay on this process a little more. So I imagine that when folks come to see you to talk about an idea they're brewing, some of it, I would imagine folks have a strong sense of what's at stake and what they want to do, and others probably just say, oh, how are you kind of ruminating about this, or can you help me think this through? So how how does one know from a nonprofit what collaboration or strategic partnership to undertake? What are the questions that they need to be asking themselves, or how do you help them sort through what would be best for the organization?
Well, usually they come in with a pretty good idea of, I mean, or if they don't, they don't stay with us for long, but they come in with a good idea of what they want to achieve through collaboration. They may not know fully what the form of that will take. And I think in some ways that is less important at the front end than really assessing, okay, are they thinking, are they thinking about, when they look at the complementarities, are they what's driving this and what's driving this now? Is it that organization A has legs and presence and service in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, but is really eager to get into Philadelphia County? Does organization B that's in Philadelphia County have an interest in accessing licensure capacity that organization A has in Bucks County? That what are the complementarities they're looking at? Is it are they looking at responding to, and you'll see this particularly in health and human services, some regulatory change in terms of how contracts and grants are being awarded by the local or state government, and where it becomes clear that there's a certain scale at which organizations need to be operating in order to compete for whatever that that new structure for funding and criteria is. And that we've seen in our market in the human service field, and particularly in the sort of greater Philadelphia region. So it really is just, it is how clear are each of the organizations about their strategic priorities, and how clear are they about what a partnership, we'll just call it that for now, what a partnership with the other organization or organizations might yield them. And how much work have they done in assessing that? And is it clear they've done enough work and they're now at a point where they truly need to get some third-party help? And some organizations can run it pretty far on their own, and certainly particularly some of the larger organizations that might have been through this before. But it is, are they ready? And is this the moment in time to pursue it? And then we start digging into, okay, so where are your respective boards? Who knows? Often, particularly if it's going to be a merger, which is, as you can imagine, something that you don't want everybody to know about until you're pretty sure you're going to at least move forward with it, or are pretty darn serious about moving forward with it. It may only be the EDs and their board chairs that know, or the EDs and their executive committee, or the EDs and one or two board members who are in this inner teams that are contemplating this merger. So, and I will say that one of the places where, to the extent these things don't go through, it's more often than not, if it's a personality issue, it's going to be at the board level more than it is at the ED level, because the EDs are very close to the realities of their situations, and they know why they have to consider this now. Question is, how well have they been communicating with their respective boards over the years about just how worried they might be about X, Y, or Z? So do they have strong board champions who can work with them and who fully understand the business case for what that collaboration might be?
That's a perfect lead into an actual question that we just got turned in. Shelley has a question around the boards. Could you share some of those quote unquote early questions that, if answered a certain way, would shut down the conversation, perhaps if board founders are against it and so on? So,
well, I think one of the processes is to hear from the respective board members who are part of it, and just to get a sense of how much do they understand the reasons for moving forward, how, how hard have they thought about it? How have they begun to imagine? And again, it's a different thing. If it's a shared services arrangement, you're not getting so fully into, cultural integration and the need to look at perhaps a whole new board governance structure. But if they're looking at a merger in particular, that's where I think boards are critical because, have they contemplated, okay, what kind of a board might you have? Are you looking at, retaining the balance of both boards? How is control going to be located? How much of that work have they begun to simulate and imagine? And, and just hearing their articulation about why they think a collaboration makes sense. The board members themselves, not just seconding or, chiming in with their EDs, because, understanding that there has to be somebody on the respective boards that really does get it and really champions it, because they're likely to have, they're likely to face challenges among their membership. And it could be, who gets to continue to chair a committee. It could be their cultural dynamics that they're concerned about between a couple organizations, between the two organizations that may be at the board level, less so than at the ED or at the staff level in organizations. But I would say throughout the whole gamut, the cultural integration, if you're talking merger, is the hardest work, and at the same time the most important work, and finding good professionals to help guide nonprofits through that process, both even at the due diligence phase, like, do we have a fit here? Or what are the challenges you're going to have to overcome if you do go forward with this deal? And then certainly post-implementation, there's a lot of heavy lifting that needs to occur, not just from the leadership of the organization, but having someone to guide that process, particularly in the early days of sensitive pairing, is really important.
And so I guess that also leads into another question that we came in terms of how important is it to work with an experienced independent consultant? So, like when you're having these initial conversations, or you're kind of contemplating this idea, whether it be maybe shared services or shared programs or whatnot, would it help to have a neutral third party help facilitate that discussion, or do you think the board chair can kind of manage that if he or she is good at that?
I think it's invaluable. I mean, that's kind of our models built on that. So I think it's really important to have a third party consultant structuring and helping to facilitate the process. I mean, the heavy lifting has to still happen at the board and executive leadership level, but having a step-by-step process to uncover sensitivities can be really important, because if one board leader is leading the process and you're talking about two organizations coming together, you right there have set up a power dynamic that might interfere with the truth telling and the disclosure of the other organization. So I think and that's where I think this model, it's not like we give a ton of money, but it is helping to give both the space, the early space to come in and just noodle a concept with me or a manager who's in another city or whoever. That's really important. For an executive director to ask what they think may be stupid questions, and they never are, but to ask them in privacy and with no repercussions. And then I think, down the road, having somebody who can more formally play that role between and among the organizations becomes, I think, just really critical. And I will say that I know in Philadelphia, and I also know my colleagues in other cities would share this and have shared it, finding qualified consultants to do that really nuanced cultural integration work, negotiation work, facilitation work is hard. You know, you've got to be able to go into these respected boardrooms at a very sensitive time. And boards, you know, we all know boards are bred and raised with this sense of, you know, loyalty to mission and loyalty, and that sometimes gets conflated with, you know, loyalty to organizational boundaries. I always say, you know, it's important to make sure that you're doing everything you can to preserve your organizational legacy and mission. Sometimes that has to extend beyond your organizational boundaries in order to do that most effectively. And getting boards to start understanding and moving with that can be hard, because I think genuinely some boards feel like they're failing in their responsibility if they look at maybe a merger or look at being acquired by another organization, or in my case, you know, look at actually dissolving an organization. And, you know, if we had not done that in a way that was planned, our multi-year research studies would have just stopped. You know, our staff wouldn't have been placed and landed elsewhere. Our 35-year repository of literature and research studies would not have had a dissemination outlet. But by planning it, we were able to preserve at least the legacy of public-private ventures. And I think, you know, much at a less severe level, looking at a merger is another opportunity to extend and plan for your continued legacy. It may take a different organizational shape. And that's you know, we all, you know, we're all tied to the organizations we work for. And it's a very hard hurdle to overcome in the case of a full transition.
So, so that, I guess, also reminds me and speaks to this notion of readiness. You mentioned, you know, part of your initial conversations about when you are meeting with EDs and or with their board chairs, you know, how ready are you? So how do you assess readiness? When should a nonprofit collaborate? When should they take place? And then when should that conversation or merger discussion happen? Because I would imagine, you know, when two organizations or an organization is struggling and they're looking to remain sustainable and you know, trying to produce their services and keep their mission afloat, that may not be the best time to consider a merger, or maybe it is. I'd be curious to hear, based on your experience, what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think all of us who work in this area feel very strongly that this should be, in a perfect world, and we're not in a perfect world right now, I will say, but in a perfect world, organizations should be looking at sustained collaborations, which is the term we use nationally, sustained collaborations as one of many strategic alternatives to consider routinely. So, you know, I mean, you could be talking about scale. What should we grow? Should we not grow? Should we, you know, should we expand our geography? Not expand our geography. Blah blah blah. This is a mechanism for facilitating and implementing strategic priorities, and it should be done in that context. And you know, I will say that the calls that are the hardest for me are when I receive, you know, I'll get a couple organizations that are calling in some desperation because they realize, oh my gosh, you know, we're not gonna make it if we don't do something different. But then it's both organizations are in that situation, and you know, I have to deliver, you know, the hard news that, look, two failing organizations does not make a strong. And that's really hard. And, you know, so sometimes the conversations I have will even be helping, you know, organizations face into just how dire sometimes it is. Most of my calls aren't like that, but there have been instances where it's really clear we're just, you know, a couple weeks from not meeting payroll, and what can you do to get your house in order and try to take control of this, even though it may be ultimately a dissolution. But it's anyway, it is it's a hard set of conversations when that happens. There is no right time, Merv. I mean, I think it's kind of like you've heard the adage, you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. I think the same thing here. You've seen one collaboration, you've seen one collaboration, and each one has its own objectives. Each one has its own history. Each one has its own timing. But usually there's a combination of internal readiness and external opportunity. Could be external forces, but that's how they finally just pick up the phone. Sometimes, or CEDs or CEOs have been speaking with each other for years about, oh, they should partner more, and maybe they've even dabbled in some kind of shared partnership. But then some combination of internal forces and external forces and or opportunities presents itself. And I will say that one of the most, the sort of three most common, we're talking three most common presenting reasons that organizations call, I think first and foremost, if you're talking mergers, it's because there's a planned leadership transition in one of the organizations. So, an ED who's led an organization, particularly long-standing ED, is thinking about moving on and has announced that or at least quietly announced that they're planning to leave within the year or whatever. That can often be the precipitating event where two organizations have partnered together, have a strong working relationship, understand each other's assets and so on. And then, the one leader announces she is leaving. That becomes a trigger point for both the organization that is transitioning with its leader, as well as maybe the existing partner. And I always say, in a perfect world, when one of these long-standing charismatic leaders has announced that they're planning to leave, to their board at least, particularly if they've been there a long time, the board, I think one of the most, if I were to start over and just put myself out in the market, I would say I would love to be a transitional consultant where somebody comes in, get an interim ED to come in to look under the hood very carefully and just say, okay, so Joanne was hired 15 years ago and she's been a rock star for this organization. But now we're in 2020. This is what we're facing. The world has changed, and our organization has changed. Our opportunities and our challenges look very different. What does that mean about who we should replace Joanne with before you just rush out and hire the search firm? I wish I could say that all search firms did, that level of rigorous assessment, and then have that person look under the hood. And there may be surprises that the board doesn't know about, right? Like, not in a bad way, but they've gotten so used to Joanne just guiding them through everything, that they aren't looking as critically at some of the organizational strengths and weaknesses. And having someone come in and do that at the same time, the board ideally is even going through the exercise. Well, do we need a new leader? Or is this the moment that we should be merging with another entity? And often that departing ED will help make that pairing, right? Like Joanne has been working with Doug and, for years. And this is the moment where she says, I'm just tired. But the vast majority of the merger transactions we've done have been where there is a planned transition of one of the leaders. And I think this is where there are two really clear differences between nonprofit collaborations or let's just say, like we talk mergers and acquisitions, between nonprofit M&A and corporate world. And in the corporate world, I think two organizations look at this strategically for the business, and not because there's a planned leadership change. If they decide, if the strategy says this makes sense to come together, they have money for a golden parachute if one of the leaders needs to transition out. So that doesn't become an important presenting issue. It's they can actually afford to help make people more than complete in that process. They also have the luxury typically of some working capital to do the due diligence and to hire the third-party consultants and resources to rigorously look at the business models and, you know, whether this advances strategic priorities or not. I think our funders and funders in other cities have come together recognizing nonprofits don't have the luxury of that working capital. So we are essentially a working capital, you know, small bit of working capital to give them the space and support to get the help they need to really assess these very important issues. And, you know, and because there isn't typically golden parachute money, the moments that present themselves as timely are leadership transition. The other two, which one of which I've already mentioned, which is some kind of a regulatory change in the marketplace, will be an impetus for these collaborations. And a third, not surprisingly for the nonprofits listening, is, you know, loss of a, you know, one of the organizations is facing a loss of a significant funder, and there is, you know, complementarity in terms of fundraising with another organization. So those are kind of the three external factors, or the internal is or two external and one internal, which is a leadership transition. Those are predictors.
And imagine, you know, given what's been going on both socially, economically, and you know, with regards to the pandemic, health, the country's health, are you seeing a lot more inquiries and requests for meetings at this time, or has it kind of stayed off, or what's your experience been over there?
Well, so, you know, what are, I guess, so yes and no. I will say that one of the things that we do at SeaChange, we're helping to coordinate a national network of similar place-based pooled funding initiatives for collaboration. And that's been, you know, a long time in the works. It's been an exciting process. And interestingly, we had planned to launch this network formally in May with a big SSIR article and blah, blah, blah. And that was planned in, I think, December. And then it launched in the middle of this pandemic and we had started working much more seriously together as a network of now 7 different cities that have these initiatives, and comparing notes. And we've been meeting more regularly through this period. And we've all been anticipating that there will be a tsunami of interest in sustained collaborations. What we have experienced is that the pace has not slowed, and it is, in some ways, the inquiries are starting to come in more. Most organizations were either getting through deals they already had in the works, as for many, the fiscal year closed on June 30th. And so, you know, there were several of us were busy through that period. And then now that the other shoe has begun to drop in terms of state and local and federal support to nonprofits in this fiscal year, we are all experiencing heightened interest from funders, heightened interest from technical assistance providers who can anticipate what's coming down the pike. And we are expecting that the actual traffic from nonprofits is going to increase significantly as this calendar year winds down. I think there's been, I mean, as we all know, there's been a certain deer in the headlights phenomena, and also just trying to survive, you know, closing your budget as well as you could with PPP and whatever else was going on for you at the end of the last fiscal year. And now facing into, oh my gosh, you know, I mean, like, I know the city of Philadelphia has made significant cuts. to nonprofits. I mean, they've had to. And so now, okay, there's this scrambling going on. We're only in August, and we are getting a lot of calls, and our pace is higher than it has been in prior years, and I think it's going to continue. The other piece that we're all sharing, kind of comparing notes, is we're also anticipating we're going to get more and more inquiries around dissolution support. And, in Philadelphia, when I was asked to do this job 5 years ago, because of my own experience, I said, I'll only do it if, as you talk about it as nonprofit repositioning, if we're also open in very select instances to share models of, thoughtful dissolution, because frankly, that's just going to have to happen. And I think, that is another difference with the corporate world. I mean, there's, I think there is more stigma because people are so attached and, viscerally to mission at leading nonprofits. You don't want to give it up. No matter what the market's telling you, you're going to fight, and understandably so. It's not like anyone's in this for the money. It's because of the mission and what you're trying to achieve. But it's not, the turnover of nonprofits is not as routine, sad as it is, in the business community. And so, I think we're now facing into a season where we're going to start seeing more of that. And again, because of my own experience, I want to help make that passage in the instances where it does happen, as we want to help as much as we can, because it's a really scary passage to face into. And so I think each of us around the country, even those who didn't have that in their guidelines before, we're all kind of looking at what we can do in our communities to work with funders and think about how do we see that important programs don't just completely disappear off the landscape, or that certain geographies don't become service deserts because all of the anchor institutions just collapsed. And so I think it's going to be I think all of us are going to be working in different ways in the coming year, trying to just wrap around as well as we can. And I will also say it's really important for all of us, and we're all looking at this in different ways, to make sure that the work that we do in sustained collaboration does not in any way advance, what may have been systemic racism and, under support for minority-led, minority-serving organizations. And so that's, begging in this challenged moment financially, begging, are there certain ways that we can be working more effectively to support organizations that are, working particularly in minority population neighborhoods, and what is it we need to do differently to support that leadership and those organizations and their missions? Again, mission first. How do we, look creatively at what our work can do to contribute to sustainability there? So there's a lot of shifting sands, but I think all of us feel that much more strongly that the wisdom of the funders who have come together to pool their resources in communities is I think at this moment in time that much more important than ever.
I agree. It's an ever shifting and ever changing moment, and the focus and the anchor around mission continuity, I think, is the key to what you're describing. It's being able to still manage and serve the people of the cause that the organization was founded on. So definitely a challenge. Got a few minutes here, and I know we have a couple more questions from folks and the attendees. But one which I want to ask, which I think will lead to some of the participants' questions, is once a decision to merge or collaborate is made, what are the dynamics, needs, values, behaviors that the leadership and board must understand or embrace in order to move forward successfully?
Well, the first thing that leadership and boards need to know is don't enter into this lightly, because it will take a tremendous amount of your time. I mean, particularly if you're talking full merger, where it will take a tremendous amount of your time in the first year or so of that new integration. And one of the first grantees we supported through both an exploratory process and an implementation grant that went into a merger. She said afterwards, that first year, 20% of my time was all about this. And again, if you think about the number of hats an ED wears in a perfect situation, that means that the other 3 jobs are being pushed to the side, and you're really having to commit a lot of time. So I think there's tremendous, eyes wide open in terms of the commitment of time that will be needed of both board and executive staff, to the extent possible, as we said, to having some really skilled facilitation, integration, cultural integration experts who can help on the process side, particularly as you go into the organization. Those are critical. I think that the other thing is just an appreciation and being very, again, this is where a facilitator can be helpful, being very open to hearing and understanding what's happening throughout the ranks, right? I mean, what are the cultural issues that you're trying to blend, and what will it take to make that more effective? But I think it's fascinating to me to try to learn, how is this Zoom world working? When the pandemic hit middle of March, we had our next proposal deadline for the fund on, I think it was like a Friday, April 1st or 2nd. And we had 3 deals that were in the hopper, that I thought, oh my gosh, there's no way they're going to come in with a proposal, because they're all trying to figure out how to shift their services online, how to work very differently, and there's no way. We got all of our proposals, and in speaking to those groups, and then one of the groups was doing a really complicated merger, and they had been planning on announcing in full staff meetings to both of their organizations in late April, and they were thinking, well, we're not going to be able to do that as we have before. But one of the things that's been kind of interesting is, and surprisingly, I mean, I'm getting COVID statements from everybody now when they come in to understand how it's affected the business, but also how's it affecting this process. And it's interesting in the integration, because sometimes there's a headquarters and there's a satellite office that are coming together, and everything becomes flat, right? We're all just, no one's traveling to Lancaster from Philadelphia. Everyone is just picking up the Zoom call at 3:00, and it's an equal playing field in a very different way. And we're actually also able to hire, not we, but they're able to bring in consultants who are really skilled that could be based in Los Angeles now. Everything's changed in how this process goes. It still requires tremendous time, and you have less water cooler opportunity to just check in with Joe, see how he's doing. There's no question that's, I'm sure, a loss. But it's changed in some ways the efficiency of being able to reach everybody in the organizations. It's too early to say, but we with mergers and implementation grants, we monitor for a full 2 years to see, from the day of that transaction, to see how does it go, and we ask people to set up metrics for what they're trying to achieve, and then they report every 6 months on how that's going and so on. And so I think the other value is just understanding this is going to take time, but really it really is, again, mission first. How is having clarity wash through the organization, and why and how, whatever this deal is meant to advance mission and achieve greater community impact. You know, it really is about sustainability of mission and achieving greater community impact. And that's what matters. And this is, again, one of many tactics that might be helpful for nonprofits. And it sure as heck is not for everyone. And, but it, you know, when the timing and the partnerships and the internal and external forces align, it has been found to be very effective if the goals are really clearly understood and if the compatibility and hurdles are navigated professionally.
So to that end, we had one question that kind of dovetails right into that. So if when you're considering merger, a strategic partnership or alliance, when there are two CEOs who aren't close to retirement, does one become a CEO and the other become a VP typically? Are there other options?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's that I would say there's usually like an EVP role or, you know, something that plays to that other person's skill set or desires. Sometimes, you know, and I've got a couple in the hopper right now where everyone goes into it with that expectation. And, you know, maybe a year later, the ED who has given up that singular leadership role decides, okay, you know, I've done my part. I'm kind of bringing the organization to, but I'm not sure I'm able to, you know, spread my wings in the way I'm used to. So, you know, I think in a good situation, there is a way that they find compatibility of their leadership strengths and take that forward. And, you know, and also in that good situation, it is the choice of the departing person to do that. It's not because they're forced out. So but it needs to be negotiated, it needs to be discussed. There needs to be, again, that's where, I mean, it's like marriage counseling, right? I mean, you know, someone's going to push you to have the really hard discussion about, okay, so if, you know, do we want kids? And if we do, how are we going to raise them? What's their religious, you know, what's their faith tradition going to be? And, you know, sometimes in the heat of mutual seduction, there's not, you know, people don't face into that stuff. So having a counselor allows the respective parties to have those conversations, including how are you two going to divide and conquer if you come together in a merged enterprise, and, you know, and not leaving too much to chance, right? Like just really exposing where the anxieties are, where the skills are, what, you know, what the opportunities are to work most strongly together. And what is it going to feel like for one of the partners to not be leading his or her enterprise in the same way?
I love that marriage metaphor. That's it seems apropos because you have to, you know, manage these relationships, manage feelings, manage, you know, the attachment to, you know, the mission and the program, especially if they're a founder, right? You know, this is technically their quote unquote baby, you know, and to give it up in that sense is a big ask.
And the values have to align. Yeah. I mean, you know, you're somehow your values have to align in marriage as well. I mean, there may be different approaches to things, but I mean, the values are really important. And again, nonprofits, you know, what's more in some ways sacred than mission and values?
Absolutely. So we also had a follow-up question here. If an organization comes to us, so if one organization approaches another organization and wants to merge before they collapse, any suggestions or for first steps or first questions?
I think first look at your own look at your own house and understand where your own vulnerabilities might be. And if the other organization is about to collapse, can you meaningfully stem that tide? You know, can you responsibly stem that tide, or are you just going to drag yourself down with that? Or, you know, and I just had this conversation recently with someone, you know, before you take yourself down with, maybe have a conversation about whether, whether this can be an asset transfer acquisition as opposed to, a merger, that it may not be practical to fully unite in a merger structure. And so I think it's just be very clear about what you as an organization can absorb. And maybe you've got the resources that their financial vulnerability will not pull you down, and that there is enough of a sort of nugget of services or program lines or talent that is absolutely worth it to, or geography, say, absolutely worth it to you to take that risk, because you've got enough buffer to survive it. But look at your own financials very carefully, and look at what you would gain. And you really do. That's where the board and the ED need to be very selfish stewards of their enterprise, because the worst case is that both become fragile and collapse by virtue of stretching too much. So understanding fully what obligations would you be taking on, ideally getting a legal look to see what are and a financial deep dive would be really, and getting again a third party to come in and help you with that is a really important part of stepping into but don't commit prematurely. Just make sure you're doing what is right by your own organization, and that there is something in it. So it's and it's hard, because often it's another organization you care deeply about, they're doing important work, but you can't always step in and save or be the safe harbor.
Great. Love those questions. So we got 10 minutes left. So folks, if you have any last minute questions for Nadya, please let us know in the Q&A box. We have a couple of questions in the queue, so I'll go ahead and ask those. But if you have any additional ones, please drop them in the Q&A box. So one of the participants asks, does the repositioning fund support nonprofit organizations outside the Philadelphia area? In other words, could us here in Louisville, kind of Louisville-based nonprofit, apply for support for your fund?
No, you cannot. So we are I'll elaborate a bit. We are, we serve the 5-county greater Philadelphia region. However, when I talked about the sustained collaboration network, we do work with, and none of them could help you either, but we do work, and the reason I'm happy to come into Louisville or wherever, we do work with other communities to make this model more accessible and understood. I've had conversations with, actually a couple funders in Louisville over the last couple of years who are interested and noodling around this concept, and have done, more than one conversation with them, not recently, but, so ideally, you all could raise awareness. And I also think one of the things you could do is go to the national website, sustainedcollab.org, which is a network that I said is a nascent network, but there are a lot of resources there. It'll show you the map of where everybody's operating. And then the other thing I will say is that SeaChange, in partnership with the Lodestar Foundation, which is based in Arizona, we do help fund a national sustained collaboration fund. It's called the SeaChange Lodestar Merger and Collaboration Fund. And there we are open to applications from around the country. So it's geographic. It is not like these other place-based funds that are in the network, but it is and has been a resource nationally for many years now, since I think 2009. So that's a place to go. So if you look, you could look at the SeaChangeCap.org, you look at our website, or you just look up SeaChange Lodestar Fund, it will come up. But we do take applications for that. It wouldn't come through one of these local groups like my own in Philadelphia. And there's, I will say there's small awards. I mean, we all make small awards, but it's dedicated money that is just so outside the normal boundaries of programmatic funders. I always say we do the really unsexy nuts and bolts work of helping look at business models and providing some capital for support of these kinds of deals. But I think it's a great thing, and whatever you can do to advocate for that kind of a collaborative among funders in your community, I think it's a really great model.
Oh, that actually was a lead in into the second question that was posted in the Q&A is, wanting to know how we could get funding support started in Louisville. So it's good to know you had conversations in the past with local funders. But can you tell us a little more about who led the creation of the fund in Philly? Someone asked about that.
Well, it's actually really, I mean, so I would say, and I'm just going to generalize even beyond Philly, almost every city that has had one of these funds organically emerge, usually there's a community foundation involved, often a United Way. So those are sort of the organizations that are close to the ground in terms of understanding what the demands are out there, and also close to other funders. And so you'll see community foundations, and in Philadelphia's case, we had both the Community Foundation, we had the United Way, and they were working on this for, more than a year before they were ready to actually do something. So these things can take time, right? But we had, I think it was 8 funders that had come together. There's a nucleus of 4 or 5 that did a lot of the early spade work on what this might look like. And they actually had hired SeaChange to come in and advise, because SeaChange had a model in New York City that they were interested in. And that was how that model was kind of franchised or developed again. But Los Angeles also had a very similar model, and we all communicated over time. But it was, a nucleus of 4 or 5 funders who were champions. We always maintain these pooled funding collaboratives work best if you've got at least 3 funders lined up. And they just worked. As I said, it took them a long while, and it took them that much longer to hire me to help come in and get ready to launch the thing. And I think that's not an uncommon storyline. One of the things I will say that we're also looking to experiment with in Philadelphia, but we're looking in the network, the national network. Well, this model, and you'll see on the website that the article that talks about how these programs sprung out of the ground in different cities and what could be helpful to Louisville. They're all content agnostic, right? They're place-based, and it could be environmental groups, it could be health groups, education, whatever it is. And so funders are actually really just investing in business of nonprofits in a way that they're not used to. I have often maintained that in the national arena, and I think even sometimes in our communities, that the way national funders will come at this is most likely going to be through program areas, so that several folks who fund climate change are seeing either challenges or opportunities among their national and even international nonprofits, and they will want to support some kind of a collaboration fund that is more programmatically based. We are looking right now at SeaChange. We are looking at 2 such national experiments, and we'll see whether either of them comes through. But I think that's going to be something we're going to see more of. I could be wrong, but just given the traffic that's been coming our way, I think it's possible that will be something that happens. So it's possible in Louisville, you've got funders who are completely focused on education or early childhood education who aren't ready to take on broader issues, but you may have a handful that will, want it more aligned to their programmatic foci. Maybe it will spring out of the ground that way. We'll see. And we're going to play with that in Philadelphia. There are some funders who don't want to join the whole experiment of the repositioning fund, but we may have an interesting pocket that we can work with them as a satellite experiment.
Sure, we'll look forward to following the progress on that. That sounds really, really interesting. All right, so a final question, Nadya, before we leave you today and you leave us here in Louisville. Any final thoughts or words of wisdom for our community as we continue to strive towards mission continuity and sustainability amidst all these challenges that we're experiencing?
Well, I guess my final words are, I feel for everyone who is trying to lead a nonprofit in this day and age. And I've been teaching, in my spare time for the last 8 years, and every year at the end, I teach nonprofit governance and among other things, but that's been the central class I've done for years. At the end of every semester, I say, you know what, I don't care what anyone says, nonprofits matter. And we've got to do whatever we can to help nonprofits and their missions survive this current challenge. Because obviously the services that all of you are providing are more critical than ever. And whether that's in the arts, which is such an important part of community and thriving as a people, or if it's in human services and some of it matters, and your leadership matters. But be open to delivering on your mission, whatever form that may need to take, and be as creative as you can, and just, and don't punish yourself if you're having to look in very different ways to deliver on that mission. But this, as I said, is a strategic consideration alternative that fits for some folks, not for all. And it's definitely not a one size fits all. So get your own house in order, stay as close to mission as you can, figure out what is most mission centric about what you're providing. Use this as, use this as a way to maybe make some choices about winnowing or refocusing your program lines, because I think that's the only way that the work is going to sustain. It's very easy to stray into a lot of new areas, and as hard as it may be to focus down, I think that's what a lot of nonprofits are going to need to do. And sometimes that will involve doing so in partnership with others. But regardless, everyone needs to understand their own business model, what's working, what's not, and double down on that going forward.
Well, thank you, Nadya. Thank you so much for all this great information and for taking the time to spend with us here today. And Louisville MSA, which includes Southern Indiana, has over 2,000 nonprofits here, both big and small. And it is a challenge, and I know we're all doing the best we can to get through. So we appreciate what you shared. And for those in the room today, listen to the webinar, thank you for taking the time to join us. The webinar today will be recorded, so if you know folks who weren't able to attend and want to share the information, I'll have that link available so that you can share that by the end of the day tomorrow. And if you don't see it, please check your spam folder. If you still don't see it, then just drop me a line. I'll be happy to resend that information. I'll send that to everyone who registered on the webinar today. We'll also send you a link to an online feedback form, so if you could take just a couple of minutes to fill that out when I send that via the email, we'd greatly appreciate it. And finally, we have a couple more webinars coming up and a few more this month. Next week, we'll have HR affiliates talk about working remotely. And then we'll have a conversation with Ben Reno Weber with the Greater Louisville Project to talk about the culture of giving in Louisville, and that'll happen next Friday. You can register for both of those programs on our events page at cnp.org. So on behalf of all of us at CNPE, thank you again for joining us today. Thank you again, Nadya. We appreciate your time. And we'll see you all again next time. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.